There was a morning when everything was perfect. Not pretty good, not mostly fine, perfect. A garden where light lived inside human skin, where every tree vibrated with the voice that built it, where two people walked with God the way you walk with a friend, and in a single afternoon it was gone. Not slowly, not gradually. In one bite, one silence, one choice, the most catastrophic decision in the history of the human race was made. And we have been living inside the consequences ever since. Every war, every grave, every moment you felt like a stranger in your own life. It traces back to one garden, one tree, and one lie so perfectly constructed it still echoes in the human soul 4,000 years later. This is not a Sunday school story. This is the anatomy of a fall that broke everything. Stay with me. This is going to change how you read the beginning of the world. Before the first word was spoken, there was weight. Not the weight of stone or water, but the weight of potential, a silence so complete it had texture, so absolute it had color. And then, from the red clay of a garden that had no name yet, something happened that would alter the mathematics of the universe forever. Imagine the moment, not as a gentle animation, not as a painting on a chapel ceiling, but as the violent, miraculous event it was. The Nefesh, the animating breath, the living soul, descending like a sonic wave into matter. The first heartbeat was not a soft flutter. It was a detonation, a pneumatic ignition. Warm blood surging through channels that had been perfectly engineered but utterly silent, suddenly flooded with the pressure of life. Lungs that had never moved before expanding for the first time, pulling in an atmosphere that was richer, denser, and more oxygenated than anything we have breathed since. The first eyes opened. Consider what that consciousness confronted in its first microsecond of awareness. Colors so saturated they would register as physical pressure. Light that did not simply illuminate but communicated. The green of a single leaf carrying more data than the mind was prepared to process. And beneath that body, this new extraordinary body, the ground itself. In Hebrew, the man is called Adam because he is drawn from the Adamah, the earth. But this is not merely poetry, it is physiology. Adam was not placed on the earth like furniture in a room. He was an extension of the earth's own nervous system. The soil was his tissue, the roots were his veins. To walk across the garden was, in some profound sense, for the earth to feel itself. And yet, in a world pulsing with infinite interconnected motion, there was something the inventory of Eden could not resolve. Every creature moved in pairs. Every sound had an echo. And Adam stood in the center of a humming, breathing, collaborative creation as the only being without a counterpart. The loneliness was not a complaint, it was a diagnosis. Something was structurally incomplete. The garden he walked through was not a park. Let that image go entirely. The vegetation of Eden existed at an intersection of the physical and the immaterial that we have no language for. These were trees that did not merely grow through the slow chemistry of sunlight and water. They vibrated, they resonated at frequencies that corresponded to the voice that had spoken them into existence, as if each trunk and canopy were still ringing with the original command, "Let it be." The sound had never fully stopped. It had simply slowed into wood and leaf and root. Into this living cathedral, Adam was given a task that has been chronically misunderstood. The naming of the animals was not administrative work. It was not the ancient equivalent of filing a spreadsheet. In the cognitive and spiritual framework of that world, to name something was to perform an act of ontological capture, to perceive the essence of a creature and to externalize that perception as sound. Each name was a note in an expanding composition. Adam was not labeling creation, he was completing it. This was the first intellectual labor ever performed by a human mind. And behind it, like a stone being pressed against the chest, was the growing awareness that among all these creatures, each arriving with its pair, its complement, its resonant partner, there was not one that corresponded to him, not one that could receive what he carried, or carry what he could give. The first sunset came. It did not fade, it performed. A cascade of frequencies across the sky that had no precedent because it had never happened before. And then, for the first time, the light fully withdrew. Adam slept. And in that sleep, something extraordinary was being prepared. The word is tsela, side, not merely rib, as the translations often flatten it, but side, as in a lateral wall, a structural face, the same word that would later be used to describe the side panels of the tabernacle, the sacred dwelling place of God. What God took from Adam was not a spare part, it was a wall, and what God built from that wall was the second face of the human temple. The surgery was performed under a divine anesthesia deep enough to silence even the subconscious. But at the edges of that deep sleep, there was sensation, a hollow forming where something had been, a quiet grief that was simultaneously a quiet anticipation. The first wound ever inflicted upon a human body was not an act of violence, it was an act of expansion. The ache was the architecture of love being constructed from the inside out. Adam woke, and there she was, and the garden, which had been humming with a beautiful but incomplete frequency, found its resolution. The thrum of creation, which had been building since the first heartbeat, arrived at its harmony. He spoke immediately, not in analysis, not in careful deliberation, but in recognition. This, at last, bone of his bone, the one whose presence turned the catalogue of the world from a list into a song. But even now, in that first and most luminous intimacy, something else was present in the garden. Something older, something patient. There was a tree at the center that did not vibrate with invitation. It vibrated with gravity. Its fruit did not glow like the others, warm and generative. This light was heavy, dense, like the light at the bottom of deep water. The command regarding it had not arrived as a threat, or even as a warning in the conventional sense. It had arrived with the force and precision of a physical law. The same authority that told water to be wet and fire to be hot had spoken about this tree. There are laws you can break by force of will. And then there are the other kind. The prohibition was not imprisonment, it was graduation. The knowledge held in that fruit was not wrong, it was premature. It was a gift designed for a future maturity, to be given freely at the right moment. To take it was not to discover what God was hiding. It was to steal a crown that had not yet been sized for your head. And in the canopy of the neighboring tree, something shifted. Not the wind, something deliberate, something watching with ancient, iridescent eyes, something that had decided that the silence had lasted long enough. They walked through that garden clothed in something that required no fabric. Their skin carried light. The Shekinah, the radiant presence, was not merely around them, it was through them, expressed in their biology, their posture, their gaze. They did not look inward. They had not yet invented the inward look. Their entire consciousness faced outward, toward the world, toward each other, toward the one who had made both. The Hebrew word for their nakedness is arumim, and in the ear of the language it lands only a breath away from arum, shrewd, cunning, calculating. The state of the humans and the nature of the creature watching them from the high branches were phonetically bound together in the fabric of the text, as if the language itself knew what was coming. The wind shifted. Something cold arrived in it, something that did not belong to the garden's original atmosphere. And above them, positioned in the highest branches to imply the authority of an elevated perspective, the serpent opened his mouth, magnificent, upright, iridescent as hammered copper in sunlight, a creature of the shining class. He had been watching the inferior clay beings below with the patient contempt of one who is certain of his own brilliance. And now, in the cathedral silence of the most perfect morning the world would ever know, he prepared to do something no created being had yet attempted. He prepared to use the gift of language to contradict the giver of language. The first lie was one breath away. The voice did not announce itself. It did not arrive with the sharp, discordant edge you might expect from something malevolent. It came in low, harmonic, a frequency that settled into the chest before it reached the mind, so that by the time the words had been processed intellectually, they had already been felt emotionally. This was the engineering of the lie, not to assault, but to seduce, not to break the door down, but to make you wonder if the door had always been unnecessary. Did God really say 5 words, or in the Hebrew, fewer? A question shaped like genuine curiosity but carrying the weight of a verdict already reached. The serpent was not asking because he did not know. He was asking because the question itself was the weapon. To introduce doubt into a mind that had never hosted it was to perform surgery without consent. The question was the incision. Eve did not recoil. She had no frame of reference for recoiling. Fear had not yet been catalogued in the human nervous system. She approached the conversation the way she approached everything in the garden, with open, intelligent engagement. She treated the serpent as a peer, as a fellow inhabitant of a world she was still actively learning. And in that openness, beautiful, innocent, architecturally perfect, there was a door the serpent had already measured. But notice what he had done with language before she even answered. He had referred to God not as Yahweh, the intimate, covenantal name, the name that carried the weight of relationship, of promise, of a God who breathes into clay because he wants to. He had used only Elohim, the powerful, distant name, the name of a sovereign, not a father. With one deliberate omission, he had quietly reframed the entire architecture of the relationship. He had turned a covenant into a contract. A father into a regulator, Eve corrected him. She recited the command, but in doing so she added a phrase, "Neither shall you touch it," that God had not spoken. A small addition, an understandable one, perhaps an attempt to build a stronger fence around the prohibition. But in making the law stricter, she had also made it more brittle. The serpent noted the addition. He filed it. He would use it in approximately 30 seconds. The masterclass continued. The serpent shifted from the interrogative to the declarative, from the question to the pronouncement. You will not surely die. 4 words that did not argue with God's command, they simply replaced it. This is the architecture of the perfect lie. It does not ask you to disbelieve everything. It only asks you to consider one alternative framing. And in that framing, something dark and glittering was on offer. God, the serpent suggested, was engaged in an act of hoarding. The tree was not a boundary drawn in love. It was a glass ceiling constructed in insecurity. God knew that the fruit would elevate them. And elevation, the serpent implied, was something God preferred to keep for himself. The prohibition was not physics, it was politics. What makes this particular lie so devastatingly effective is its partial proximity to truth. They would gain a kind of knowledge. Their eyes would open. The serpent was not trafficking in pure fabrication. He was trafficking in distortion, which is always more dangerous. He took a true thing and tilted it 3 degrees, and in that tilt, the entire horizon shifted. And where was Adam during this conversation? He was there. The text is unambiguous. He was with her. And he was silent, not absent, silent, not deceived, paralyzed. This is the first instance of a catastrophic human failure mode that would echo through every subsequent generation. The capacity to recognize a wrong and choose the safety of inaction over the risk of intervention. He heard the lie. He understood at some level that the ground was shifting, and he chose the shelter of passivity over the exposure of protection. The serpent reached out and touched the fruit. Nothing happened. The fence Eve had built, "Neither shall you touch it," crumbled on contact. The law she had made stricter had just been visibly broken without consequence. And in that moment of apparent disproof, the distance between her hand and the branch shortened considerably. What followed was not a sudden lunge. It was a slow gravitational collapse, and it operated simultaneously on 3 distinct levels of the human architecture. The text describes them with surgical precision. The fruit was good for food. It appealed to the body, to appetite, to the oldest and most immediate form of desire. It was pleasant to the eyes. It appealed to the aesthetic dimension, to the hunger for beauty that is woven into human consciousness as deeply as hunger for bread. And it was desirable to make one wise. It appealed to the spirit, to the ambition of the interior life, to the ache for transcendence. This is not coincidence. This is a complete assault. Body, soul, and spirit simultaneously compromised. The temptation was architected to leave no defensive position uncontested, and beneath all 3 levels, the smell of the fruit was changing. It was beginning to radiate something extraordinary, a scent that seemed to carry within it everything Eve had ever wanted, including things she had not yet found words for. The senses themselves were being recruited as instruments of persuasion. The word the Hebrew uses for what was about to happen, this reaching, this taking, is not the gentle word for receiving a gift. It is the word for seizing, for grasping. It carries the connotation of a raid, an acquisition by force. Whatever it was Eve was about to do, it was not the acceptance of an invitation. It was the storming of a gate. Her hand began to move. If there is a moment in the history of the universe that deserves to be observed in the most compressed and excruciating slow motion, it is this one. The fingers extending, the space between skin and branch collapsing by millimeters, the individual cells of her palm approaching the surface of a fruit that had been growing patient and heavy since before she had been built from her husband's side. The choir stopped. This is not metaphor, or rather it is metaphor that points at something real. The created order, which had been maintaining its unbroken frequency of praise since the first morning, went silent. Every bird, every current of wind through every leaf, the insects, the rivers, the deep harmonic of the earth itself, all of it simultaneously held its breath, as if creation knew it was about to become a different creation. As if the universe understood, before the humans did, the weight of the choice occurring in this small clearing. The stem snapped. The sound was precise and final. Not loud, it didn't need to be. It had the quality of a sound that, once heard, cannot be unheard. Like the first crack in a wall that has been load-bearing for centuries, structurally catastrophic in its smallness. The word the text uses to describe the wisdom this fruit promised is sakal. And sakal does not mean the broad, generous, luminous wisdom of Chokmah, the wisdom that builds houses and considers eternity. Sakal is narrower, more predatory. It is cunning, tactical intelligence, the knowledge of how to get what you want. It was not the wisdom of a god. It was the wisdom of a creature who had decided that getting was the highest form of knowing. The juice reached her lips. It stained her skin like ink on a document, like a signature at the bottom of a contract whose full terms she had not been permitted to read. She turned, and Adam was there as he had been from the beginning of the conversation, present, witness, complicit in his silence. Their eyes met. And this moment, this specific, loaded, unrepeatable exchange of glances, was the last moment of pure human contact that would ever occur, the last look between two people who were still, fully and without fracture, themselves. What passed between them in that look is beyond complete analysis, But the text gives us Adam's internal logic, and it is both comprehensible and devastating. He understood what had happened. He was not deceived in the way Eve had been deceived. He made a calculation, a choice, and the choice, stripped to its core, was this. He would rather share her death than survive her absence. He chose the woman over the Creator. He chose the derivative over the source. It was an act of love so catastrophically misapplied that it would install grief into the bloodstream of every child they would ever have. He took the fruit, he bit down, and somewhere in the root system of every tree in the garden, something changed. The frequency shifted. The thrum that had been sustaining the connection between the physical world and its source flickered once, like a power grid absorbing a surge it was not built to contain. Then it went out. The light that had been living in their skin, the Shekinah, the radiant residue of divine proximity, did not explode or vanish dramatically. It dimmed. It faded with the quiet, terrible finality of an ember losing its last warmth. And what replaced it was something the human nervous system had never processed before. Not darkness exactly, not cold exactly, but the grey, indifferent, abrasive texture of a world that was no longer curated for your comfort. A world that no longer recognized you as its steward. Their eyes opened, but the opening was not expansion, it was contraction. The infinite, outward-facing consciousness that had spent its existence looking at the world and each other suddenly collapsed inward. For the first time, they looked at themselves, and what they saw was not what they expected to see. What they saw was not glory. What they saw was not wisdom. What they saw was exposure. In the distance, somewhere deeper in the garden, a branch snapped under a deliberate footstep. The sound carried across the suddenly unfamiliar air with a new quality. Not the sound of a companion arriving. The sound of a judge approaching. The hands moved before the mind could form a plan. This is the nature of panic. It bypasses the deliberative and goes straight to the desperate. Leaves. The fig tree was closest. The fingers tore at the broad, flat panels of foliage with a frantic precision, working with the focused urgency of creatures who had just discovered, in the space of a single breath, that they were exposed in a way they had never been exposed before. This was the first act of human technology. Not a wheel, not a fire, a mask. The first thing the human mind invented was a way to hide itself. The irony is embedded in the botany. Fig leaves are not gentle. They are coarse and abrasive, covered in fine hairs that irritate the skin on contact. The primitive garments being assembled in that clearing were not soft. They chafed. They itched. They were already, in their first minutes of existence, a source of low-grade suffering. And this is the pattern that would repeat itself across every civilization that followed. Our attempts at self-salvation tend to introduce exactly the kind of discomfort they were designed to relieve. But the deeper horror was not physical. It was psychological. For the first time in human experience, the self had become a problem. They had always been two, a we, a harmony, a unified expression of the same divine image, facing outward into the world together. Now, suddenly and irrevocably, there were two separate E's. Two frightened, isolated interiors staring at their own damage. The connection that had made them a temple had developed its first structural crack, and the draft coming through that crack was cold. The sound of God walking in the garden arrived not as a gentle rustling, but as a resonance, a vibration that started in the ground and moved upward through the body. Every footstep was an event, and with each event, the distance between the hiding place and the one who was coming shortened by exactly the amount required to make escape feel permanently, mathematically impossible. There is a particular kind of absurdity that only becomes visible in retrospect. Two creatures, fashioned in the image of the omnipresent, crouching in the undergrowth of a garden that had been designed to be transparent, attempting to conceal themselves from from the one whose awareness is the precondition for their own existence. They were trying to hide inside the mind of the being they were hiding from. The internal experience of that hiding is not difficult to reconstruct. Every vibration of the ground transmitted through their palms, where they pressed against the earth. Every shadow that moved in their peripheral vision, arriving first as the thing they most dreaded. The body, this new fallen body running now on the diminished fuel of a severed connection, processing threat in a way it had never been designed to process. The elevated heartbeat, the shallow breath, the narrowed vision. The entire sympathetic nervous system firing for the first time. Fear had arrived, fully formed and fully operational, as if it had always been waiting for exactly this invitation. God called out, "Where are you?" And here we must sit with the weight of what this question actually was. An omniscient creator does not ask questions to gather information. He asks questions to create space. The "where are you" was not a search query. It was an open door. It was the first invitation to confession ever extended to a human soul, a grace disguised as a question, wide enough for a full admission and a full restoration to walk through together. Adam spoke from the shadows, not with confession, not yet, but with something that had the precise shape of an almost confession. "I was afraid because I was naked." The first self-disclosure in human history, and it was simultaneously an admission and a concealment. He told the truth about his condition while withholding the truth about his crime. This is the particular grammar of shame. It can describe its effects while refusing to name its cause. The trial that followed had the structure of a formal proceeding, but the texture of a breaking heart. God moved through the interrogation with the patience of someone who already knew every answer and was asking anyway, because the dignity of the accused required the chance to speak. Adam spoke first, and what he said was not only a deflection, it was an indictment delivered with remarkable audacity. He did not say, "I took the fruit." He said, "The woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit." In 4 words, he had pointed the finger at 2 defendants simultaneously, his wife and her maker. The woman was the instrument of his failure. The creator was the architect of his circumstances. He was the victim of a gift. The linguistic detail in the Hebrew text is precise and damning. In that moment, Adam did not call her by her name. He did not say Eve. He said the woman. He had performed the first act of human depersonalization, reducing a being of whom he had once sung in recognition and wonder to a piece of legal evidence. The person who had been bone of his bone was now Exhibit A in his defense. The intimacy of the garden's first morning lay somewhere in the distance, already in ruins. Eve, following the geometry of the blame shift, turned in the only remaining direction. "The serpent deceived me." Also true. Also incomplete. Also a way of saying the agency was elsewhere. The chain of accountability had been constructed with every link pointing away from its author, and God turned to the serpent. What happened next was not negotiation. The serpent received no question, no invitation to confess, no open door. The serpent received a sentence, and the sentence was physical. The majestic, upright, iridescent creature who had occupied the high places of the garden, who had positioned himself above the humans to imply a superior perspective, began to change. The elevated posture collapsed. Whatever limbs or elevation had made him a creature of the shining class retracted, withdrew, compressed. He was brought down not by an external force pushing him down, but by the internal logic of a curse removing what had held him up. He was consigned to the dust, and the dust, in the framework of that world, was not merely a location, it was a rank. To eat dust was to be permanently positioned beneath the feet of everything that walked upright. The being who had sought to elevate himself by pulling others down was now geometrically, cosmically, and permanently below. The pride that had architected the lie received a sentence that matched it in precise inverse proportion. But in the middle of that sentence, between the curse on the serpent and the description of his permanent humiliation, there was a phrase so quiet that it almost seems to slip past. Almost. God spoke of a seed, not yet born, not yet named, a descendant of the woman arriving in the future at an undisclosed date, who would engage the serpent in a final confrontation. The serpent would wound the heel, the seed would crush the head. In the darkest moment of the darkest chapter in human history, embedded in a curse, spoken over the ruins of a garden that was already beginning to change its temperature, a counterstrike was announced. A rescue operation had just been authorized. The first human couple, crouching in the wreckage of everything they had been given, could not yet see it clearly. But it was there, like a single ember in the center of a cold hearth. The long war had just been given its final chapter, written before the first battle had fully ended. Then God turned to the humans, and what he described was not punishment in the punitive sense. It was consequence in the structural sense. The world was not being made worse by divine anger. It was showing its new face now that the connection had been severed. A world unplugged from its source does not continue to function as designed. It becomes resistant, indifferent, expensive. The ground, which had yielded to Adam's cultivation the way a living body responds to a healthy nervous system, would now present itself as a problem to be solved rather than a garden to be tended. Thorns and thistles, the defensive architecture of a world no longer oriented toward human flourishing. The labor that had been joyous, creative, the full expression of the human calling, became toil. The same hands doing the same work, but stripped of the current that had made the work feel like worship. And for Eve, the multiplication of sorrow in childbirth, the bringing of new life into the world, which had been designed as the most fundamental act of co-creation, would now be inseparable from suffering. The world would receive its new inhabitants at a cost. Every birth from this point forward would carry in it the memory of a garden where life arrived differently. Then the final sentence, short, dense, absolute. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. The invention of mortality, delivered not as a rage, but as a verdict. The body that had been built for an open-ended tenure, the body that had been vibrating with divine frequency, had just been given an expiration date. And that date would apply to every body that followed from it, through every generation, without exception. And then Adam named her. In the smoking wreckage of the most catastrophic morning in human history, with the full weight of the curse still resonating in the air around them and the certainty of death freshly installed in the architecture of their bodies, Adam turned to his wife and gave her a name that contained within it a radical and almost incomprehensible act of faith. He called her Eve. Chava, the living one, the mother of all living. He was holding a death sentence in one hand and a declaration of life in the other. He chose the declaration. He looked at the promise of certain death and named the future it seemed to negate. This was not denial. This was the first recorded act of faith in human history, the decision to speak life in the direction of the evidence for death. The garden around them was beginning to change its atmosphere. Something in the air had shifted, the way a room shifts when its occupant has left and the warmth begins to dissipate. The vegetation, which had been oriented toward them like a congregation toward a speaker, had begun to assume the neutral posture of things that no longer recognized their authority. The exile had not yet been formally announced, but the garden had already begun to practice for their absence. God approached them again, but when he arrived, his hands were not empty, and they did not hold a sword. The animal did not understand what was happening. This is perhaps the most unbearable detail of the entire sequence. that the first death in the history of the world was experienced by a creature that had no framework for it, no anticipation of it, no capacity to assign it meaning. One moment it was breathing the same rich original air that everything in the garden breathed, and then it was not. Adam and Eve watched. They had to. This was not incidental, it was instructional. The life leaving the eyes of an innocent creature is not an abstraction. It is a specific, biological, irreversible event. The warmth departing from the body, the weight of it changing, the absolute non-negotiable finality of the transition from was to is no longer. This is what the words, "dying you shall die," actually looked like in 3 dimensions. They had been told in language. Now they were being shown in biology. God worked with the skins, and what he fashioned was not ceremonial, it was functional. Real coverage for real bodies that had for the first time become vulnerable to the abrasion of a world that was no longer configured for their comfort. But the deeper transaction was not material, it was theological. The fig leaves, their own invention, their self-produced solution, the product of human ingenuity applied to human failure, were set aside, replaced. What covered them now had cost a life. What covered them now had been provided, not produced. Grace, in its first physical expression, wore the texture of a sacrifice. The smell of blood was new to the garden. It would not remain new to the world. The movement out was not instantaneous. There was a direction to it, a geography. They were not teleported to the outside. They walked, step by step, through terrain that had been the entire context of their existence, past trees they had named and paths they had worn smooth and corners of the garden they had returned to again and again, because something in those specific angles of light had spoken to them in a frequency they could not articulate but could not ignore. All of it was passing. All of it was becoming memory in real time, which is the most acute form of grief, the loss that occurs while you are still present enough to measure it. The sound of the gate was not dramatic. It did not need to be. The most significant closings in human experience tend to arrive quietly. The soft mechanical finality of a latch, the subtle shift in air pressure that tells the body before the mind processes it that something is now on the other side of a boundary it cannot cross. That sound, that click of a closing that was simultaneously a closing of everything, installed itself into the deepest layer of human memory. You can still find it there, in the universal human experience of homesickness for a place you have never been, in the persistent low-frequency ache of not quite belonging that runs beneath the surface of every culture, every century, every life. But the expulsion, God made clear, was not pure punishment. It was mercy in a form too painful to immediately recognize as mercy. The tree of life still stood inside the garden, and a fallen creature with access to immortality is not a creature given more time to heal. It is a creature given more time to calcify. To eat from the tree of life in this condition would not have been restoration. It would have been preservation of the wound. The door was closed, not to deny them return, but to make return meaningful when it finally came. The first night outside was a different kind of darkness. The darkness inside the garden had been intimate, warm, the temporary concealment of a world that would reintroduce itself with the morning. This darkness was indifferent. It did not know them. They had to build a fire. Not because they were cold in the way we use the word casually, but because without the living warmth of divine proximity that had been their atmosphere since the first heartbeat, the night had edges that required answering. They built the fire. They sat beside it. And in the flickering, imperfect, carbon-producing light of that first flame, humanity invented one of its most enduring habits, gathering around a small, manufactured warmth to hold the dark at bay. They turned once. Of course they turned. And what they saw at the eastern entrance of the garden stopped the breath. The cherubim, not the soft, rounded figures of decorative art, but the true celestial beings, massive and compound and terrible in their beauty, stationed at the gate with the deliberate permanence of architecture, and between them, or above them, or moving through them in a way that defied spatial logic, the sword, flaming, turning, covering every angle simultaneously, sweeping through every possible approach vector with the systematic thoroughness of a guardian that does not rest and does not negotiate. Adam looked at that light for a long time. The sword that blocked the way back was made of fire, and fire, in the symbolic vocabulary that was already beginning to organize itself in the human mind, was the only thing that could make something holy. To pass back through was not impossible in principle, but the path ran directly through the flame. There was no route around it. There was no altitude from which it could be bypassed, no depth at which it could be circumvented. The only way back to the garden, the sword's geometry announced, was through transformation, through something burning away that could not survive the fire. The first winter came. The leaves on the trees outside the garden, trees that had never been required to perform this function before, turned colors that had no precedent and then released themselves to the ground. The first time the world demonstrated, in plain botanical language, that beauty and death were no longer separable, that the most vivid display could be the prelude to bare branches and frozen ground. They watched the leaves fall, and somewhere in the architecture of that watching, they understood that the world had learned a new rhythm, a cycle with a cold chapter built into it. Children arrived, the first generation to inherit a world they had not broken, but would spend their lives navigating the damage of. Cain came first. Eve named him with the word forgotten for acquired, and the name carried the full weight of her hope. This was the one she believed, the seed that had been promised over the ruins of the garden, the one who would walk back through the fire and undo what had been done. She held him and saw a future in which the gate opened again. She told them stories, both of them, Cain and then Abel the younger, the quieter one who tended flocks with a patience that seemed to belong to an earlier world. She told them about the light that had lived in their skin, about the trees that vibrated with the frequency of their creator's voice, about the naming of the animals and the morning when the garden found its harmony. She told the stories with the particular intensity of someone who needed the listener to believe them, because the stories were the only thing that remained of a world that had left no physical evidence. The children listened, and in the listening, there was something that could not quite reach the territory of full belief, not because they doubted their mother's honesty, but because the gap between this world and the world she described was too vast, too structural, too total. The time of the light sounded like what it was, another country behind a locked border, guarded by fire. The sacrifices came. 2 brothers, 2 altars, 2 offerings, 2 entirely different orientations of the heart. One brought what he had grown. One brought the firstborn of his flock, the best, the cost. And the differentiation in how these offerings were received was not arbitrary, it was diagnostic, not of the gifts, but of the givers. What you bring to the altar tells the truth about what you believe about the one receiving it. One offering rose, one did not. And in the face of the brother whose offering had been accepted, Cain read a verdict he had not been prepared to receive. The ground absorbed it. This is what the text records with quiet precision. The blood of Abel cried out from the ground. The same Adamah that had received Adam's body as its own, the same soil that had been the substance of the first man, was now the receptor of the first murder. The earth itself was a witness, and the earth remembered, and the earth spoke. Adam and Eve stood over the body of their son, and now, finally, completely, and with no possibility of abstraction remaining, they understood what "dying you shall die" looked like at its full scale. Not just the slow dimming of their own bodies over time, not just the resistance of thorns and the ache of toil. This, a specific face, a specific weight, an absence with a name that would not stop having a name simply because the person had stopped being present. The fall had not broken one thing. It had broken the architecture of everything. The relationship with God, severed. The relationship with the earth, adversarial. The relationship with the self, fractured into fear and shame. And now, the relationship with the brother. The most intimate human bond after marriage collapsed into the oldest and most primal act of violence. Every fracture in the human story from this point forward was a tributary of this original breaking. Every war, every betrayal, every cruelty performed by one person upon another. A reenactment of a morning in a garden when a man chose himself over the Creator and set in motion a logic that would arrive, inevitably, here. Cain moved east, further from the garden, further from the fire of the sword, further from the memory of the light. He built a city, not a home, but a fortress. Stone and structure and defensible perimeter, a declaration of independence from a God he no longer trusted, and an earth that had turned against him. The line of Cain moved outward, always outward, building and accumulating and fortifying, trying to reconstruct by human means the safety that had once been simply the air. And now look forward. Look at the long, strange, brilliant, brutal parade of everything that followed from that single morning. The cathedrals rising in stone toward a sky they were trying to address, built by hands that still carried the phantom memory of proximity to the one they were reaching for. The hospitals, the libraries, the laws, all of them attempts to manage the damage, to organize the grief, to build systems of care in a world that had lost its original system of care. The graveyards, where every stone is a reiteration of the same verdict, applied to a different specific person who loved and was loved, and is now the same dust that started the whole story. There is a feeling that runs through all of it. Philosophers have named it in different vocabularies in different centuries, but the feeling is the same. The sense that something is missing that was once present. The sense that this world, beautiful and terrible as it is not quite the right size for the interior that inhabits it. That we were built for a country we have never visited, but somehow remember. That the longing itself is evidence of an original belonging. This is the phantom limb of the species, the ache where the garden used to be. The exile is not a historical event that concluded. It is the water we swim in, so total and so constant that we require a story like this one to remember that water is not the only possible element. That there was a time before the swim, that there will be, according to the counter-strike announced over the Serpent's defeat, a time after it. The road goes on. Dry and long and sometimes cold, and lit at its far end by something that will not resolve into clarity from this distance. A flickering light, distant but consistent. The sword, perhaps, or something beyond the sword, on the other side of the fire, where the gate was always designed to open again. The long exile continues, but the search for the gate has never stopped.